Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
Yeah, the president sounded like he's concerned about it, but no specifics, no change in policy.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
Last week's severe weather and winter storm in Texas left millions of homes without power there. On Saturday, President Biden declared the situation a major disaster and plans to travel to the state this week to survey the damage. Meanwhile, the House Budget Committee is meeting to formally consolidate the $1.9 trillion coronavirus stimulus relief. President Biden will need Senate Democrats to stay united on this vote in order for it to pass, as no Republicans are expected to support the package. We'll start there with our all-star panel. National editor of the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter, co-founder and president of Real Clear Politics, Tom Bevan, and co-founder of The Dispatch and host of the Remnant podcast, Jonah Goldberg. Well, Jonah, we should start with you, since you have a firsthand knowledge of the disaster in Texas. You were stuck there, right?
I was very much stuck there. I was in Austin there for a special trip with my daughter, and we were supposed to come home last Sunday, and instead we didn't get out till Friday. The first thing that just I think people need to appreciate, it was a bad storm, bad icy conditions. Before the storm, there were bad icy conditions around. But if this had been Milwaukee, Detroit, or any place like that, that big Sunday storm would just have been known as Sunday. I mean, it was like they have no salt trucks. They have no infrastructure dealing with this kind of thing. And you forget, living on the East Coast, how much our sort of city, suburban life is geared around these eventualities. And so what was, in many ways, a minor storm by Midwestern and East Coast circumstances was a life-altering hellscape for Austin and Houston and these places.
But I mean, not to belabor your trip, but you had 5 flights canceled. You were finally had to get out of Austin and go to a different place, Houston, to get a flight. I mean,
yeah, I had 5 or 6 flights canceled on 2 different airlines. I bought a backup flight on American. I was supposed to go out of United, and then they canceled that one on me. There's literally no way to get food. And one of the, I mean, it was a little sort of Walking Dead-ish in that in the beginning, the few hotels that were, functioning, they were serving food to outsiders. And then by about day 2 of this, the residents were like, wait a second, we can't, these are interlopers. They're foreign barbarians. We must protect our supplies. And so they turned away anybody from the outside, and you got to eat what diminishing stores we had inside. It was pretty intense.
Well, it's a story for years to come, definitely, hopefully.
And I would just like to testify Jonah is correct, because I'm in Chicago. We've got 3 feet of snow on the ground. We got 18 inches the other day. And they don't cancel school, nothing. I mean, we're all about it. It's like so.
In DC, my kids, were virtual and they got a snow day. Explain that to me. The teachers couldn't make it from the living room to the kitchen to get to the computer. I don't know what happened. Amy, but about the situation with the power, I was thinking the other day that here is Texas, and obviously there are multiple things that went wrong on the grid and weathering and all that stuff. But here's Texas that has this storm, and they totally lose power, and it becomes a major, major issue. We're on the cusp of making cars electric. GM is going to transition to electric cars. If we can't power Texas, how is our grid going to handle everybody plugging in their electric cars?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think the issue, it's like with everything, right? Like, Bret, we have the capacity to do it. We just have to have the organization and the structure to handle it. And I think what we learned, of course, is, one of the challenges of having your own grid is that you don't have a backup. If a once in 100-year, whatever many years, this event occurs like this. So in some ways, you're right. It doesn't make a whole bunch of sense for Texas to invest a lot of money on insulating their fuel lines and their windmills, whatever, for the possibility that they're going to get this freak snowstorm that's going to plunge the state into a freezer for almost a week. At the same time, if you are on your own grid without any ability to then say to those in the West or the East, hey, can we borrow some because we're in a little bit of trouble here, then this is what you get. And I think, look, it put in pretty stark display to all Texans, and that's the question in front of them, right? If they want to have that question, which is to say to their elected officials, look, okay, we get it. Here was the deal. Being on our own system meant that we had much more flexibility. We didn't have to live by some of the federal regulation. It also meant that we could try out this concept of, having a more of a free market when it comes to electricity. But for the folks who are on the free market right now, who have $10,000 electric bills, they probably have a very different opinion about it than they did last year. So what I would love to be able to see, and I hope we can actually have a real conversation about how this stuff works. And Americans finally got to see, unfortunately, it had to be in such a, it's usually like this though, in a crisis where you see how your government, how your infrastructure actually works. And there we are.
Yeah. So, Tom, we're in the process of this 1.9 trillion coronavirus debate on this bill, which we found out today, none of the funds for schools actually are scheduled to be spent in 2021. So all the talk about that money is needed for opening schools seems a little misplaced. But we got all of this debate about 1.9 trillion, but really on the big picture after Texas, infrastructure has to be front and center on a number of fronts. It's not just roads, it's literally our grid.
Yes. And I think the good news is there's a lot of bipartisan agreement on that fact. I mean, Republicans and Democrats, infrastructure's long been, I think, at the top of the list in terms of something that everybody thinks needs doing, right? Roads, bridges, airports, et cetera. I think there's a difference of opinion about how to pay for it. But there has been pretty solid bipartisan support for that. I suspect that this is another example, data point that's going to increase that. But, look, I think Amy's right. Just going back to Texas for a second. I mean, I read a couple stories that said, but for the folks who are working, who were sort of quick on the switch of setting these rolling blackouts, that it could have been much, much worse, like months long blackouts in Texas, like Lord of the Flies type stuff. And government bureaucracies they're reactive. They don't plan ahead for these things. They don't have contingencies. It's only after you have a crisis situation like this that there's an after action report and people figure out exactly what and try and, rectify and fight the last war, not necessarily be looking ahead to, okay, what else might happen in the future that could cause these kinds of crises that we can plan ahead for. That's sort of the normal state of things. But certainly moving ahead with infrastructure would be something that, again, a lot of people would be invested in, and it would be good for the country.
Jonah, let me turn to coronavirus. I've heard a lot of increased frustration about the messaging on coronavirus. And that is, you had Dr. Fauci out this weekend, and he could not answer if grandparents both got the dual shots, the second dose, could they then see their grandchild? And he wouldn't answer that question, saying he's going to wait for the guidelines to come out. I guess it's just frustrating for people. Like, you finally go through the thing, you get the vaccine, it's 94% effective. Kids don't have a lot of chance of getting it. And yet there's still an apprehension about telling us what we can and cannot do.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I mean, I was just writing a column about this. The Biden, because he's a new president, he gets a certain grace period, he gets a sort of fresh start kind of thing. The problem is that the frustration with the pandemic is cumulative. We've been doing this for a year now, and you can cut Biden slack for being at the beginning of his presidency, but he campaigned on a back to normalcy of being like sort of not Donald Trump. He's accomplished that. The problem he has now is that for most people, when they're talking about back to normal, they're talking about getting the pandemic behind them.
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.